Good afternoon. Welcome back, everybody. It's good to see you here. We hope that you've had a nice lunch and you enjoyed the concurrent sessions that were held just before then. I'm only hearing amazing things thus far, but I often say that I'm normally the last person to hear of anything that's not bad, but it's good not to hear bad, don't get me wrong. So I'm glad that everybody's having a really good time. I do have the pleasure of announcing the first panel for Conference 2018, which will be speaking to the subject of what would the ideal family law system look like. As a sector where we have a lot of family law services as part of our network, it's a very timely discussion. As we all know, and we have been hearing this morning, we're in the thick of a review process being led by the ALRC. So I'm really just here to introduce Marie predominantly, who's a member of the board and who will be introducing our panellists today. But we do have Judge Matthew Myers, we have Dr. Andrew Bickerdike, we have Rachael Field, and we also have Bruce Smyth. And I must say, at a personal level, I am constantly in awe of not only what these people do and achieve, but also the time that they really give to the network and to FRSA. And to me personally, I've found that over my time here at the organisation, they've been very giving of their knowledge and their expertise, and I just wanted to take the opportunity to personally thank them for that. And also one slight correction to the program is that we have Associate Professor Bruce Smyth, but he tells me that he's recently achieved his Lifetime Achievement Award and will be appointed a Professor of Family Studies, and that will take effect. Congratulations. And that will come into being on the 1st of January next year. So congratulations, Bruce, well received, well deserved. So I'll just introduce Marie, who will be our chair for the panel. Marie is the CEO of Relationships Australia NT, and she has been in that position for 12 years. She's also a member of my board, and she's been on my board for the whole time that I've been there. And once again, I extend my thanks to her for her gracious nature and for her knowledge that she shares with me right throughout that time. Marie brings to this conversation the experience of having delivered a broad range of family and children's services, especially to large numbers of Aboriginal and Islander clients in remote and isolated parts of Australia. Marie has a varied background, including community development, clinical work, policy development and management. Her leadership and organisational skills were nationally recognised when she won the Northern Territory Telstra Businesswoman of the Year award. She brings the experience of 30 years of living and working in the Northern Territory, including in remote Aboriginal communities. Marie has considerable knowledge in delivering a wide range of family and children's services, including family relationship centres, other family law services, counselling, education and other family and relationship services, counselling for traumatised children and adults, and capacity building projects including Communities for Children as a community partner in several projects. So I'm sure that she's going to lead a very rigorous discussion today, so I invite Marie to the stand. Thank you.
Thank you, Jackie. It's always a little bit overwhelming when people read out a whole paragraph about you and sort of put your whole life into one paragraph, or your work life. But thank you for those kind words. What would the ideal family law system look like? I think for our sector, the single most important thing happening at the moment is the review of the family law system. Some of you might be absolutely directly involved. I know there's people here who are post-separation managers, FDRPs, and others might be somewhat involved. You might be a counsellor who assists getting clients ready for their FDR sessions. And others of you might be thinking, why is so much of this conference devoted to family law? And I would suggest that, in fact, for all of us in our work, and possibly even in our personal lives, family law system is really, really important. I think if you acknowledge that we all work with families or people who have been part of families, and we look at the statistics around separation, then the family law system is touching many, many of the lives of the people we work with, our clients, and the programs in which we work. Even yesterday, where we were touching on other subjects, Howard Barth mentioned the 4 A's: attachment, autonomy, achievement, and altruism. And these words and the way he explained them are really integral, not only to traumatised clients, but also to family law clients. Stephen Crosley mentioned the need for vigilance around data and bringing out the truths, and I think gave some very pertinent examples of mistruths being used in promoting programs that weren't in the best interests of the clients they were meant to be helping. I think in my own experience in our organisation, I can think of a family that we were working with in one of our centres. The children were attending our counselling for families and children who'd been traumatised. As young people, they then moved into the youth justice system, and they were clients in our youth diversion system, which is a restorative alternative to incarceration. And that same family has attended FDR, they've worked at the FRSA, they've been in couple counselling in the FARS program, and the father and some of the stepfathers of the young man I'm thinking of have also been in our men's behaviour change program. So I think the spread of programs that we're all involved in make this a really pertinent question to everyone. I'd urge you as we go along to also be thinking of questions, because there's a fair amount of time for questions of the panel from the audience. So just to quickly introduce you, and I know Jackie's mentioned who we've got here, and it's quite obvious because of gender that Rachael Field, Professor Rachael Field from Bond University, is sitting first on your left. Next to her, Professor Bruce Smyth from ANU. After that, we have Dr. Andrew Bickerdike, who's here in his capacity as a part-time commission of the Australian Law Reform Commission. And next to him, Judge Matthew Myers, AM Federal Circuit Court of Australia. So join me in welcoming our distinguished panellists. Thank you. And they're each going to get up and introduce themselves a little bit more fully and talk to you about their work and their perspective on the topic. So Rachael, if you'd like to come up first. Thank you.
Thanks, Marie. Hi everyone, I'm Rachael Field and I'm a legal academic at Bond University. I teach dispute resolution subjects and the first year of law, so foundational fundamental principles of law in society and that sort of thing. And I'm also at Bond the co-director of the Dispute Resolution Centre that many of you would be familiar with. Lawrence Bull and John Wade and Pat Kavanagh started that back in 1989 and it's still going strong. Other relevant things about me are that I'm also the president of Women's Legal Service in Brisbane. I've been the president there since 2004, but volunteering at the service on their management committee since 1993, so I have quite a long history with Women's Legal Service. And also, along with Sue Armstrong, who's here today as well, initiated the Australian Dispute Resolution Research Network a number of years ago, and that is growing in strength as well. And a little achievement of mine this year was to get my FDRP accreditation and my NMAS accreditation, so it's been a big year. I'm going to put my academic hat on though in terms of thinking about this question of what would the ideal family law system look like. And I think we're perfectly positioned here at this conference because we've had the benefit of 7 or 8 wonderful keynote speeches that really have almost provided a bit of a roadmap for us in terms of knowing what we need to be doing to have a better system. And Jackie's words are ringing in my ears that we have the solutions. We do know what good practice can look like in our sector, and we need to be enacting that. So I want to take a bit of a big picture perspective and think through, if we were going back to a blank page, if we had the ability to really start thinking afresh, we obviously wouldn't chuck the baby out with the bathwater. There's lots of good things about our current system, but we might configure it differently, and we might put different fundamental principles in place as the foundation for the system. So I just want to think a little bit out loud with you about some of those things. But also just to thank Jackie and her amazing team, the board of FRSA, for putting on this great conference and just hitting on the really important issues for the sector at the moment. It's a wonderful conversation to be a part of, and it's a privilege to be part of this panel. Thank you. So the big picture, I think part of the problem is starting with the word law. So I think that's misguided in terms of thinking, what does the family law system have to look like? Because all of us in this room are part of a very important system, but you might not, in terms of your work, think of yourselves as part of the family law system, and yet it all should be joined up and integrated and part of a system that is about, as Judge Harman said this morning, the most fundamental unit of our society, the most important cornerstone of our society, which is families. So in a 21st century liberal democracy that's based on the rule of law, what should a contemporary family system look like? And it should really, I think, be built on principles of protecting and supporting that fundamental unit. So safety and well-being for families and their futures as human beings and part of a society needs to be the emphasis of how any system should be properly designed. So I've got a couple of, I've got three points that I'd like to make in terms of, if we were going back to basics, what would be the cornerstones of a potentially appropriately and intentionally designed system. First, it would be an accessible system. That's a principle of the rule of law, accessibility. Everyone should be able to have access to it. And as part of that, government needs to get realistic about what proper services cost for protecting and supporting families into the future. It has to be an investment in Australian society to have a properly resourced family system that supports parents and children properly after they've gone through the very distressing process of separation and relationship breakdown. So government has to fork out the funds. One thing I didn't mention earlier was that I was involved with the development of the coordinated family dispute resolution model for matters where there's a history of DV. And as we understood it, part of the reason why that wasn't ever rolled out was because it was a very resource-intensive and expensive model. And that's right. It is. And that's what it needs to be a properly designed model for that particular context. So the cost of a system that is responsive and contemporary just has to be something that the government, I think, invests in. But it also has to be accessible in terms of being understandable to the people who are using it. So, for example, the Family Law Act does need to be rewritten, doesn't it? If people don't understand what it means when they go to it, everyday people can't work it out for themselves. So that's an important aspect of accessibility too. I think the system should have the second cornerstone be fit for purpose. So it has to be designed for contemporary Australia, not the 1975 model that was good back then. Society is different, the pressures on families are different. The challenges of domestic violence, for example, are critical and ones that need to be a part of the design of any system that's contemporary and responsive. So it has to be fit for purpose. And then thirdly, I think the system has to be humane. I don't think it's humane. You know, when you talk to people about how they've travelled through the family law system, they've been damaged by it. And no system should do harm to people in that way. I think it's, and this might be a bit controversial, but I think certainly the best interests of children come first, but I think we can't forget that parents also matter. And they feel, I think, often when they're going through the system that they don't matter. Their distress isn't acknowledged. And so a system should be built around humane responses. These are human beings going through very human dilemmas, and they need human responses, which is why processes like mediation are so important, because far more than a court, mediation can provide that humane response. But there's also a wonderful, I don't know if you've heard of it, a therapeutic jurisprudence theoretical framework that actually could guide the design of a new system in this humane way. And it has as principles of therapeutic jurisprudence doing no harm. So when people come to legal processes, that there should be as little harm done to them as possible through their engagement with the system. And that means that using things like, or ensuring procedural justice, I'll just put my glasses on because I can't remember the problem-solving courts and transformative mediation, and having all of those things sort of integrated. So I think those are my three cornerstones of a new system. It would be contemporary, responsive, but key things would be accessibility, fit for purpose, and being humane. That's it.
Thank you, Rachel. So Bruce now.
Okay, so what would the ideal family law system look like? I love this quote: for every complex problem there's a solution that's simple, neat and wrong. I love Lionel Murphy's original vision of the Family Law Act, sweeping away the laws and procedures of the past and providing a new era of calmness, rationality, presided over specialist judges, not generic judges, Matt, but specialist judges, assisted by experts. No, that wasn't a personal dig, Matt. That was actually, you know where I was going. I was talking about the...
You haven't heard my resume.
That did not go well. And would introduce speedy, less expensive, less formal procedures. A lovely vision by Lionel Murphy. So first point I want to make is there's lots of good stuff going on. The quality of people, including Matthew and Andrew and others. FRCs, FDR services programs, joined up services, child inclusive practice, family law pathways networks. I'm hoping they're funded after the 1st of June. 1st of July 2019. I think they're one of the great things that came out of the 2006 reforms. And in many ways, the stuff that goes on in Australia in the community is the envy of the world. Like the community framework, people look at what we do in Australia and are just amazed. Here's my ideal family law system. Judges, Matt, you get yellow cards and red cards. Yellow card. If lawyers... I'm talking about lawyers for the moment because I know there aren't many here. If they argue after the decision, they're persistent fouls, fake diving, if they pretend they've been brought down by a tackle, yellow card, vulgar language, if they take off their shirt during a point of difference, wasting time, leaving the game and come back in without permission, yellow card, warning. Red card. Unprofessional, absurd plays, like lunging into the opposition with 2 feet during a slide tackle. It's career-threatening, it's not acceptable. This was a teenager who wrote this little description because I didn't quite understand what red cards do. Extreme actions like insulting someone's mother and discriminating remarks and spitting. Lawyers, red card.
Excellent.
So about 10 years ago, I used this thing, and we might get time to use it today, depending how we go. How do we deal with lengthy delays and costs? We go to the Magic 8 Ball online. It is awesome. Last time I presented this, someone bought a house in the middle of my presentation based on the Magic 8 Ball. I met them a year later, they gave me a big hug. They made lots of money out of it. Awesome. What is the family law system? Dispute resolution, I'm not sure. Support services, is child support included in the family law system? I kind of struggle with actually what the system comprises. The basics, and this really is from the FRSA actually, from their submission to ALRC, keeping kids and families safe, affordable, accessible, easy to understand, navigate, minimise conflict, and so on. You know, I get distressed knowing that when people are separating, and many call me at all times of the day and night, people are looking for information, for advice, for support, for advocacy. You know, where do people find these things? I know they can go to services, but for me, that's a big issue. And then when people get stuck around risk and safety, it makes sense around adjudication. So these are some drawings that Laurie Maloney and I did a long time ago. It's the 30-year evolution of the family law system as we see it. So phase 1, 76 to 85, a court-centric system. So we had family court counsellors in the court, people went through that, and away it went. In 85, of course, community-based systems started to emerge in the second phase, and that was pretty cool. And then from 06, we get this quite coherent, integrated system, building on really out of the maze in many ways. And you can see I've added person A, B, C and D for same-sex families and a whole lot of other things that get complicated. I've often wondered, playing with child support, where can separated parents go to get help about child support if they want to talk about child support? Because DHS child support program won't give parents that help, they'll give them a formula. And I'm wondering if some conflict can be resolved a lot earlier by just having a discussion around money early in the piece. Now, I'm going to focus on this top bit, pressure points I call them. So the first pressure point between FDR and FRC is up to the family courts. We did a study a little while ago, the Interrelate funded with AGs, and we looked at Section 60I certificates. We had a whole lot of questions. What's the purpose of these things? What's the purpose of the categories? Are they useful? Do judges make use of them? Do we need safety plans in the interim? Because people may not end up going to court once they get a certificate. There's a whole discussion around Section 60I. As for the court and the pressure points, clearly simplifying the Act, there's a lovely paper about out of the US in Texas, choking in complexity and specificity. And God bless Richard Chisholm in his retirement, has been rewriting the Act, waiting for the day. And I'm hoping that this ALRC commission, this review, will help Richard get some of his thinking into it. You know, I wonder, and this is some thinking from my friend Laurie Maloney, are there kind of at least two types of cases where basically, you know, the ordinary disputes, where there's no risks, there's no safety, they're just straight ahead, they're a dispute. And the system should support these. But where you've got disputes that are fueled by violence, substance abuse, mental health issues, and so on, that's obviously the court's priority. You know, we've been wondering, are there cases going to court that actually shouldn't be in court? And can we do a better job of actually keeping those cases out of court? And we can talk about that. Improved screening, triage of cases, and Laurie and I and Steve Denby in the US have been talking about entrenched parental hatred and naming and working with hatred. And pretty much finally, when the Act came in and the court was first set up, there was a big debate around psychiatrists and whether they had a role to play in any of this. And the system stayed away from this because it pathologised our relationships. But I'm just wondering, with how pointy things are getting with the court now, whether there's a role to bring psychiatrists back in to the system to deal with personality disorders and other kind of forms of addiction and so on. Just throwing some ideas around. And finally, strengthening couple relationships. I've just written a chapter for the US, looking at couple relationship education and parenting education. We do a lot of great work around parenting education, and those programs are going gangbusters. We do hardly anything around couple relationship education. And I'm stunned that the government hasn't seen that those two things are related. And that's my time. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. And I think Dr. Andrew Bickerdike has a hard act to follow there. Lucky we saw he had a sense of humour this morning.
Yes, you should never work with animals, children, or Bruce Smyth. So how I get to be here. So I'm a psychologist, or as generally I'm referred to, I'm a non-lawyer. I started my working life as a family therapist and a marital therapist, and I was doing my internship when I was undertaking my training, and I went to a family therapy organisation, probably one of the leading organisations in the country. And at that time, they were having trouble with their numbers. They were just overrun with clients. And so they introduced a single session therapy model, which is very well researched and very well regarded. And so I became involved in that, and my job was to actually work with clients in that format and to follow them up afterwards, because half the therapists there thought that wouldn't work at all because they were used to 50 sessions. And so my job was to evaluate the program. And what I encountered was an amazing frequency of children in particular that were struggling because of the experience they had of their parents' separation. It was by far the most common presentation, and their outcomes were they were traumatised by their experience, and it was an extremely difficult client group to work with because often the damage had been done maybe 5-10 years ago, and these children were acting out as a consequence of that, and they'd lost their relationship with one parent, or they were with a parent but they were very angry with that parent. And it just occurred to me at the time this was something that hadn't come across my radar. I hadn't really realised that there was such a damaging events happening in the system. So that led me to actually focus on that area, and then did some research on it and became a FDRP, a family mediator. So that's coloured my experience ever since. I've been working in this area because of that first experience where I said, well, these children have been damaged by a system, and my belief was the system itself was the problem, not necessarily the parents themselves. They were being drawn into a system that was harming their children. So, if I was to talk about what an ideal family law system would look like, it would put the children at the centre of the dispute. It put the children at the centre of the conflict. The children would become the client. So if you're a parent who's turning up to any professional in the system, that professional would very quickly turn to questions about, okay, so do you have children? How are they going? Do they know what's going on? Has anyone talked to them? It wouldn't mean that the children would necessarily have to be consulted by somebody, because as we've talked about earlier in the day, there are many parents that actually manage the difficult process quite well. But it's those that get caught up in the system, in the adversarial system, who find that their children suffer because of the conflict, and the conflict itself is exacerbated by the system they find themselves in. So I would like there to be a system that actually attended to, if you like, there's sort of a parental alliance index that looks at every intervention, every engagement with the family and says, is this engagement harming this valuable thing we have, which is a parental relationship or a relationship between the parents, and is it harming or doing damage to the children who are part of this process? I don't think often they're actually in the picture, but the interaction they have with the system, the adults, is often exacerbates their conflict, and as a consequent exacerbates and harms the children's experience of their parental divorce. So I'd like there to be sort of a permanent, almost like a family capital index that says, is this intervention, is this process harming the family unit here? There should also be, by the way, an index that's related just to the children, which says, okay, are these children attended to, and are they being harmed by the interaction that's occurring? So that's why I was reasonably pleased with the suggested reform around the child advocate. From my point of view, I think that's potentially a crucial reform, because the most damage to children and the most damage to families are done in those clients that actually end up in the court system. And the child advocate is actually someone who's designed to work for the child and to attend to the child's needs as they travel through the court system. So to add to that, you would have heard talked about already, if you looked at the law reform discussion paper, there's this conversation in various contexts about the need for what we call a case manager or a navigator. The idea is that you need to have someone who assertively puts themselves into the family situation to assist a family navigate their way through the family law system. that covers what I'd like to cover. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew. And we've got one more panel member to hear from, Judge Matthew Myers.
I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, pay my respects to their elders past and present, and pay my respects to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. I said I'd tell you a little bit about my background. My background was I was a lawyer. I became a specialist in family law. I was an accredited family law specialist in 3 different states. All I did towards the end of my career was family law day in, day out. I was a nationally accredited mediator, and I ended up going to Bond University and gratefully became a family dispute resolution practitioner. I was an independent children's lawyer. I did just family law day in, day out, and ultimately I found myself in a position that I'm in. The family law system doesn't need a change. The answer is, of course, yes, it does. A lot of people would say that it's in crisis. A lot of people say it's worn out, and it probably is. Litigation, I think, when I talk about litigation, I'm talking about in court. There are some things litigation just can't fix that you can. And litigation's not always the answer. In fact, most of the time, it's never the answer. I was in court, had a couple of busy days in court last week, and I had a couple of matters, and I was sitting there listening to them, thinking, oh, I can't fix this. One was a really sad case. It was some grandparents who had made an application to visit their grandchildren. Their mother had died. It was the paternal grandparents, and they were in a massive dispute with the father. And what it stemmed from was the mother had suffered numerous bouts of cancer, and towards the end she decided, I cannot do this anymore. And the father supported her. Her parents could not reconcile that she just didn't want to keep going and having more and more radical treatment, and she died. And there was a massive falling out. A massive falling out to the point where the grandparents don't spend any time with their grandchildren. They don't see them at all. And under the Family Law Act, grandparents have got a right to make an application. They make an application, they come to the court telling me, we have a right to do this. Fix it. Make this better. Give us our relationship with our grandchildren when we hate their father because she allowed our daughter to die. I can't fix that. The Family Law Act can't fix that. But you can. If you think about some of the things you do with grief counselling, talking to people, actually getting them through this horrendous journey, you can fix that. I can't. The Family Law can't. Family Law Act can't fix that. There's a couple of things that judges see in my court day in, day out that are really, really hard. One's what you might call resistant parenting cases. I can't fix that either. I see a lot of parents come into my court where the kids have started to get a bit older, they're in their teenage years, and they're starting to become difficult. The kids are misbehaving, mum and dad maybe don't have the parenting skills necessary to deal with evolving teenagers, and one parent puts their foot down, and it generally means they decamp to the other parent's household. I've got kids, but I haven't got kids that are really into their teenage years yet. But of my friends that have those children that are still together in relationships, they say to me, I put my foot down on my daughter or my son, not literally speaking, but figuratively speaking, and said, you're not going to that party, you're not doing this, whatever you're doing, you've got to do these things. And they say, I will disown, you're disowned, I disown you. You're not my father, you're not my mother. And I say to my friends, how long does that last? And one of my mates said to me, it lasted a couple of hours, and his daughter got sick of it and said, oh, right, you're my dad again, I give up. Or maybe it might last for a day. I won't speak to one parent. And then they just wear themselves out. What's the point? Okay, all right, I'll get over it. Here's the thing that's different. When parents are separated, there is a difference. When one of those children says to their father, I disown you, you're not my parent, and they go and knock on the other parent's door, there's a difference, because in that household, that parent often says, come in, pick my side, thanks. You see in your parent the things that I see. You see the reason why I left him. This, you identify, you get it. And the answer is, of course, no, they don't. And I can't fix that, but you could. You could say, look, this isn't about parental alignment. This is about maybe parents trying to work out how to deal with difficult teenagers. Give them some parenting skills. So the family law cannot fix those things. Lawyers see parents as a client. They see them as a profit centre, and it's true. I see people in my court and I often just see the litigant. You see the person. You see somebody in crisis, and that's the difference that you can bring to trying to fix the family law system that the courts can't do through litigation. The other thing I see so much, and I don't know, I know that you can fix it because you deal with children so differently, so very, very more carefully than I ever do or possibly can in my system, where I jam children into interviews and I have them ask questions. And I think I've got a little bit of time, I've not too much left, but if I've ever told this story to people, I apologise, but I'll tell you a story, it happens to be true, and it's not about me and my parents are together. I remember at university you've got to pick electives. I picked family law only on the basis that it suited my timetable. I could sleep in and get to uni late. It's true, for no other reason. And my best mate, exactly the same. It meant we could go out on a Thursday night. We didn't have an early start on Friday. Never thinking I'd ever end up in the situation I am, but nevertheless, here I am. Anyway, I remember it's true. I remember walking into the first family law lecture. I knew nothing about it. My parents weren't separated. They stuck on a VHS videotape and said, we're going to play you a video about family law. Anyway, up comes this horrendous video. Mum and Dad's fighting and fighting. Things are going badly. Mum and Dad separate. They got some kids. I didn't know it at the time, but they obviously apply for an AVO because there's some real fights going on. Things keep getting worse. They end up in court. They get cross-examined. The judge delivers a decision. They walk out of there unhappy and the fight keeps continuing. I'll try and wrap this one up quick. But anyway, it wasn't a great video. I thought, gee, this is a great subject I just chose. Looks really, really joyous. Anyway, the lights came back on and I looked at my mate and he had tears in his eyes. And I thought, I didn't know why. I thought maybe the lights were too bright. The lights are a bit bright here. Anyway, we went out to lunch and I was sitting down eating some lunch. And he said to me, and I knew his parents were separated because I'd seen him at his 21st. He said, that was me. He said, not literally me, but that was me and that was my sister. I knew I had a sister. And I said, I thought your parents got along. He said, no. He said, things were really bad. He said, all I can remember growing up when I was a little kid was my parents screaming at each other. He said, things were so bad, I would go into my sister's room, I would put my hands over her ears so she didn't hear my parents scream. And he said eventually they got it. Eventually they realised they hated each other and they broke up. And he said for a short period of time that was good because it stopped them fighting. Thanks. But then he said they worked out they could fight about us. And he said I can remember them going off to see the lawyers and the next thing I know they were off in court. And he said I knew when they were in court I would be sick, literally sick, worried about it because I knew when the courts events were coming up. He said then I got interviewed. I got interviewed by somebody in the court, which I obviously know now to be a family consultant, and they sat me down and they asked me and my sister, who do you want to live with? And he said to me, how could I possibly win? How could I win? What answer could I give? He said it was the worst day of my life. I make that order every day. I do that to children every day in my job, and I know that's what they go through. And the parents are asleep and they don't, when they hear it once, it's not enough, they want to hear it once, twice, 3 times, 4 or more, and they still don't get it. Anyway, and he said, things didn't die down, they kept getting worse and worse and worse and worse. He said, I can remember, then coming up to my final hearing, all I can remember is vomiting in the morning, worrying sick about it. He said, I know the day of the hearing, and he said, I was just sitting at home after school so worried, and they came home, or he said his mum came home. I said, well, what happened? He said, they just stopped. They just stopped. They stopped fighting. He said, I didn't know why at the time. He said it made a world of difference to him and it made a world of difference to his sister. And he said, remember the 21st? I said, yeah, I remember the 21st. Nice 21st. Your mum and dad got up and said some really nice things really together. He said, yeah, remember that? He said, I pulled my parents aside after that speech. And he said, I spoke to him. I said, what made you stop? He said, remember how bad things were. What made you stop? And they said to him, because we were sitting in the court listening to a judge talking about you and your sister, knowing that he's never seen you in your life, will never meet you, and is going to make decisions about you for us. And we decided we loved you more than we hated each other at the time, so we stopped. You can help parents love each other more, help them love their children more than they hate each other. I often can't. So that's the changes you can make and change the family law system. Anyway, I'll grab a seat.
Well, thank you, Matt, and particularly for sharing that very personal and emotive story with us. And I guess I was going to start with Rachael because you were sort of starting with the big picture, but one of the words I really picked up in what you were saying was the word humane. And I think Matt's story is probably a good segue into that. So could you tell us what do you think? My glasses on so I can read my own writing. So what do you think would make a system more humane? Like I'm a social scientist, so this sort of is the thing that I picked up on, but I guess I'm also quite a concrete thinker, so I'm wondering, like, what would it actually look like? You know, what would the system that's more humane look like?
I think, and just going on from what the judge has just said, I think family dispute resolution has to be right at the centre of a humane system. We know that we can do family dispute resolution in a number of different ways, so we can make models that suit different contexts, and they are all going to be better than the litigation option. Yep. So for me, there's big things that have to change if we're going to get there, though. I think as a legal academic at law school, we need to be doing things very differently with our students and teaching them quite different things. Dispute resolution should be a core compulsory subject for every lawyer. They should all have an understanding of how mediation operates, and also what its principles are. And I think if we can make lawyers more humane, we can help make this system a little bit better as well. And I think that lawyers have so much to learn as well from the social sciences and from psychology. I think psychology should actually perhaps also be a compulsory subject at law school, because lawyers are dealing with people and people's problems, and the problems of law are life problems. Yep. They're not legal problems per se, they're about life and what's gone wrong in people's lives. So we have to have the right skill set if we're actually going to help fix things in the way that the judge has suggested we should. And family dispute resolution, mediation in particular, but also other elements of dispute resolution processes on the matrix. For example, when I was talking about things being fit for purpose, there needs to be a dispute diagnosis sort of done and disputes channelled into the right process for that dispute. So sometimes litigation will be necessary, but lawyers have to have the skills to be able to diagnose the dispute and the conflict in order to get it to the right spot. And so I think, a humane system would be one that has FDR at the centre and is informed by psychology and those elements that Howard Barth was mentioning are about well-being. So if we have a system informed by what we know from a hard science contributes to well-being, that would be more humane for a start.
Great, yeah. I mean, I think we're seeing people at a time of great stress in their lives in the family law system. They're not at their best. And we need people and a system that can bring them back to being at their best in a difficult situation. So I think that's,
if lawyers fuel adversarialism in people at this worst time of their life, they're doing harm, aren't they? They're doing harm to people.
Yeah. Can I say?
Yeah, I was about to bring you in here, Matt.
If you look, people watch legal programs on TV because it's entertaining, and I've seen the practitioners do it. It can become a sport. You'd want to win. Lawyers have often got personalities such that they want to win, and you don't win by rolling over. You don't win by pulling punches during cross-examination. And financially, you don't win by settling your matter out early. So that's a flaw in the system, and it's a hugely corrosive process as a result.
Mm-hmm. So, Rachel, you mentioned that there is a place for litigation.
Yeah.
Matt, would you like to comment perhaps on where you see litigation fitting appropriately into the system?
Look, I think there are some things where there needs to be. Look, if I need to make it, there are some things where the court does need to intervene, where there's real abuse, where there's lack of parental capacity by often both parents. There are things that the parents can't sort out and the court needs to get intervene, and it's maybe when you've got grandparents coming in and taking over the role of the parents because mum and dad are ice addicts and they can't look after themselves, let alone look after the kid. But when it's parents fighting about their children rather than fighting for them, litigation is not the answer.
Mm-hmm. And maybe you've also seen some of the detrimental effects of litigation in your work. Do you want to maybe talk a little bit about some of the bad sides of litigation for people?
Parties financially and emotionally wrung out. If the parties in my court were a lemon, often they're squeezed out so hard there's nothing left but the pips. Mm-hmm. They're often the lawyers are fighting right at the beginning, making a small matter big. And then I'll get the parties later on down in the litigation and they'll be completely financially busted, they'll be emotionally busted, and surprise, surprise, they'll be self-represented. And then there's no money left. Mm-hmm. And then the matter resolves.
Yeah. Thank you. I mean, Judge Joe Harmon this morning also mentioned the litigation opioid, was it? And I thought that was, an interesting point as well, that maybe people just almost get hooked on it and forget about what they're there for, perhaps.
Yeah, I think seems a lot of criticism around, and you as practitioners, if you do FDR work, have heard it. There's so many delays are bad and it takes so long. People break up yesterday, they're not ready to settle their matter tomorrow. They actually need time to heal, they need to go through a grieving process, and they need time.
Yep.
So the trouble is, I think some people then get, as you said, sometimes they use litigation as a way of evening up old scores. Mm-hmm. Gives them a venue.
Yeah, I think that point about time is really important because people have been in a relationship relating in one way and they need to find new ways of becoming separated parents or separated couple, and that does take time. Yeah. I'll just remind people in the audience that you're going to get a chance soon to ask questions, so keep thinking of those questions, jot them down, be ready. Maybe Bruce, if I go to you next. What do you think about entrenched interpersonal hatred? What part do you think this is playing in the whole system?
Yeah, so there's a small group of, Laurie and I think it's about 4 to 5% in the separated parent population where it's actually not high conflict and it's not a dispute as such. And we're wondering what that might be, and we're thinking that hatred is part of that. And it's funny, I met an RA Queensland person at the 70th anniversary of RA this year, and we were just talking about this casually with my friend Michael Hunt. And we're talking about hatred, and he said, it's funny, sometimes we'll ask a question in session and we'll say, do you think you'd be better off if your ex-partner was dead? And people go, yeah, I do. And then they follow up a question, do you think your kids would be better off if their other parent was dead? And they go, yeah, I do. And clearly these aren't legal problems, these are relationship problems.
Yeah.
And you're just kind of wondering what the law's doing around these, but obviously where there's risk and other things. But it's a wacky thing. So we've got we talk about two types of hatred. Reactive hatred, where basically people are reacting to a bad situation. And that's kind of normal. Like if you're in an abusive relationship, it's natural to hate the person who's causing you your grief. And we think that's a time-limited thing. And we actually think, Laurie talks about name it to tame it. We think at a low level where there's basically reactive hatred going on, you actually can work with it. But once you move into this entrenched hatred, where people are using hate as a form of addiction, as a way of connecting and staying close to someone, as a proximity behaviour, we think this is a different kettle of fish, and we're playing around with ways of trying to identify and screen for that. So the court can come along. So the work we've been doing is, with practitioners, we say, you think you're working with high conflict. If we said in some cases it was actually hatred, and here are the qualities and characteristics of hatred so you can see them, might that change the way you work with some of these families? And we're wondering if there's value of moving to an irrational self-interest framework where you play to irrationality and interests rather than the good old model of mutual benefit, rational approaches, which ain't going to work with these folk. And we can talk about that a lot more along the way.
Yeah, I'd be interested to hear what the other panellists think of that. I think we've got 3 FDRPs on the panel as well as all the other professional qualifications. Does anyone want to comment on how to work with hatred?
Well, I'm interested in what Bruce is saying about the self-interest model. I think that sort of throws up a whole lot of questions, and we've been having some discussions about this offline, about the principle of self-determination in dispute resolution, and whether in some situations that's actually asking too much, whether we're really asking too much of the parties at this terrible time of their lives when they're in chaos to then be creative, option generators for their own situation. So I think, that's and to ask them at that time to be empathetic to the other side as well is a difficult thing. So I'm interested in this idea of a self-interest model. I'd like to see how that might pan out in the FDR kind of context as a tool that might sometimes be appropriate.
Yeah, no, I think it's an interesting point, yep.
I could add to that too. I think FDRPs by their nature are optimistic and over-optimistic, and I think that's necessary. Otherwise, you'd lose your mojo working in the field that we work in. And so I do think sometimes we are in a position where we put clients in a place where they can do harm to each other. I remember doing some research many years ago. My job was to actually videotape mediation sessions and then go through them all and try and work out what happened. And I had hundreds of hours of mediation sessions. And there were a few there I noted where I think, despite the best efforts of the mediator, despite their enormous skills, they were actually participants in a process that actually harmed a relationship. And my problem with that is I'm not quite sure what the alternative is, because they'd be harming themselves if they were put in the court system too. Perhaps the court system would be an even more damaging place for them to harm themselves. So I think Bruce has hit on a problem. I'm not sure he's come up with the answers yet.
I wonder, Andrew, though, do you think that there's space on the dispute resolution matrix for families of a model that is more advisory, more directive, more, where the ethics, the ethical framework of it sort of sees party self-determination as supported, not harmed by an intervention on the part of the FDRP, for example?
Yeah, no, I do. I do think that that conciliation is a model that we don't use well enough, and I think the parental coordination and what we've talked about earlier today, the ongoing support for people post-separation, particularly high conflict cases, it's where you have a professional FDRP perhaps or a conciliator who tries to get people to agree around the issues that they've now found themselves in dispute, and if they don't, they just say, well, this is what you're going to do. And they have that model that works in America, and it's been...
the MEDARB.
The MEDAB,
No,
are you
they saw
thinking?
a parental coordination.
Oh,
So
okay.
basically
Oh, sorry
they
about
have special masters,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
these people will try and facilitate an agreement, but the
Yeah.
court gives them the power to say, well, if it's a parenting matter that you need to sort out, then you're allowed to make a decision around that. Now, people can appeal to court, but they rarely do, and they accept the authority of this third party. So I'm not sure whether the Australian culture would adapt to that as well as the American culture, but it's an idea that's worth considering, I think.
Yeah, I
Sounds
think
hopeful.
just like we were saying before, that children can't be asked to make those decisions. It's mind-boggling for them. Probably couples in high conflict, it may well be mind-boggling for some of them as well to try and come up with the solutions
Yes.
at that point.
And if someone else makes the decision, well, then it is a win. It wasn't a win or a loss in a sense. It's actually someone else taking away the decision making.
Matt, just before you, I think were you going to say something then?
No, I just
Good.
think it sounds like a hopeful idea, yes. I was going to say, America's a pretty litigious place. I think if the Americans can get their head around it, surely we can.
Yeah, maybe. I just wanted to quickly say that, the game here around hatred is disturbing a dynamic where you've got a couple of people, like two planets bouncing around a child, chasing each other. What can you do? There's a lovely book called Bringing Peace into the Room, and chapter 4 is around tricksters and deception. And, how can you be a creative disruptor? What tactics do you use to disturb this dynamic? And one little story I tell is the King's Counsel, who basically has 4 pictures of horses on his room, on his wall in his office, and the client comes in and he says, look at my 4 racehorses. I own 3 of them, but I don't have the money yet to buy this 4th one. If you give me a case, I'm going to buy the 4th one and I'm going to let you name it. I'm giving you naming rights. Now, that has quite a disruptive effect on some clients thinking, what the fuck am I giving you all this money for? You're going to buy a horse race out of my misery. So what tactics can you use to kind of just twist this whole thing and change the dynamic? That's the game.
Yeah, well, I think child inclusive practice
Yes.
is one of those tactics that I've seen used in that way, yeah.
Yeah.
And in a positive way.
Yeah.
Not that buying your racehorse isn't positive.
No, but funny enough, if you talk to Jen and Laurie and Tom Fisher about it, who developed it,
Yeah.
I think they'd be the first to say there's still parents who just cannot hear their kids. They
Yeah.
don't have the emotional maturity, the ego maturity. They lack the stuff
Yeah,
to be able to hear anything around their children.
yeah,
To me, often that's entrenched hatred.
yeah. So we've been talking mostly about parenting matters, but I think a lot of the parents who are separating are also dealing with financials and property, and I guess it's really pertinent with the funding that was announced yesterday. Andrew, what do you think is it a good idea to mix property and parenting matters in FDR?
Definitely, I think it is. I think some of what we've just been talking about there around hatred and entrenched conflict, sometimes when you work as an FDRP and you're dealing with parenting matters, you do find people who are in really high conflict who have the capacity, they're good people and they're good parents, and you can engage them around how their children are affected by their conflict. And if you can't do it by coaching them, you can do it by child inclusive practice, where they actually hear the words of their children and their children talk about their pain. And sometimes those good efforts are undone because that you can engage them about the needs of their children, but when it comes to property, they can let loose if they are in high conflict and they have some sense of antagonism towards their partner. So when I cut my teeth as a mediator, it was standard practice to do parenting and property matters in the same mediation, and it's only in the last 10 or so years with the introduction of FRCs where there's been a huge growth in parenting FDR and a corresponding reduction in property. But for me, I always found it was important to put both together so that you could weave into the conversation both parenting and property matters. And I have had many experiences in the past where I've actually worked on parenting matters, and there's been clients who wish to leave the property matters out of the conversation, and they've reached what I consider to be a very appropriate parenting agreement, and I've got cases in my mind, I can think of them now, where the whole thing collapsed because they'd gone off to get a legally decided property matter, and that had soured the relationship and all bets were off. And so for me, I can't think of a reason why you wouldn't combine parenting and property. Obviously, as a FDRP, you need the skills to be able to do that, but I think that's well within the repertoire of many people who work in the system.
Yeah. I think if we're thinking about the ideal family law system, that seems to be a good element to bring back in as a way of revising what's happened over the last 10 or 12 years and bringing back something that could be really useful.
It does, and also it talks to the resources of the family. So as I was saying before, my interest in making sure that we attend to the sort of the parental capital, this idea that you need to protect the parental relationship. Well, I think actually there should be a duty of care to protect the resources of the family. Many families end up skinned by the system, and they come out of it shell-shocked, and I don't think that's fair on the kids, let alone on the families themselves, on the parents themselves.
Yep. All right, good. Okay, have we got some questions from the audience? We might also have time for panellists to comment further or to ask each other questions, but I can see one hand there. And a few more. Yep.
Hi, I'd really like to voice my appreciation on that comment, in particular about preserving the resources of the family. I think that's something that really needs to be supported by the family law system. But I'd also like to get the comments of the panel on the point of child support. Often in mediation, the hidden agenda, I guess, of parents is wanting the kids more so they don't pay child support. Another parent not wanting to give the kids for more time because they want more child support. The connection between child support and the nights spent in the care of a parent. Is this a good thing, a bad thing? Does it need to change? I'd really like to hear what the panel's views are on that point.
I think Bruce is chomping at the bit to answer your question.
Brian Rogers and I did some research as part of a large study around child support, and we asked parents the question, 5,000 randomly selected people in the child support system. And we asked the question, do you know the number of nights you need to get a reduction in your child support? And when people said yes, we then said, okay, what's that number? And we did the same for pro-rating of FTB splitting. And what we found was people who say yes are more likely to be wrong than right. That is, there's a large amount of erroneous knowledge about how the number of nights and time and money work. There's a lack of policy knowledge. There's a knowledge vacuum there. I have to say the publications around child support are very helpful. Like that sort of information is on page 47, and it has huge consequences for family and family financial well-being. So we did that research because the idea that everybody is running around playing petty accountants, counting the number of nights and doing their dollars, there's no doubt that some people do it. But the idea that everybody's doing it, we didn't see any evidence of that. 8% before the scheme changes were correct, and right down to after the scheme it was 3%. FTB splitting, 1 in 100 people knew what the rules were. There was one person out of 5,000, and I met this person recently who knew the rules on everything. And she told me that. She said, I was actually in your study, because we thought it might have been an idiot savant or something like that.
I was going to say, it says more about the person than the system,
but
I think.
it turns out she actually is a lawyer who specialises in child support, and she just happened to be in the study. So here's the bottom line, and I remember doing some media on this. The bottom line is, if parents are arguing around strategic bargaining around money and time, chances are they don't know what the rules are. And the problem with that is that people may be fighting over something that's actually not right. So, a carer may not be giving the other parent more time when they could be, and there's no impact around the money. So it's a tricky area.
That highlights the benefits of lawyer-inclusive models, doesn't it? In terms of getting that legal advice and not being able to bluff or work with misinformation.
Can I say,
Or
as long as the
having-
lawyers actually know what the
Yeah, I was
answer
about
is.
to
I
say,
know, yeah.
you maybe need, like Andrew talked about, having a family advocate in the room who could sort of assertively look after the emotional needs. You maybe need a financial counsellor or someone with specific financial advocacy.
FMC down in Melbourne, the Family Mediation Centre, Kim Fraser there trained as a financial counsellor, and then she became an FDRP. And it's a great little model because
Yeah.
basically as soon as you get stuck on money, they wheel Kim in and she does all of the Centrelink rules, the property stuff, she does it all, and then
Yeah.
they push her out and they go back to mediation. In an ideal world, people
Yeah.
would have that resource.
Yeah.
Sounds like a family's hub.
It does a bit, doesn't it? Yeah. So yes, I think that's a very good ad for the Family Hub idea, because financial advice would certainly be something that you'd be looking for in that. So to the questioner, does that answer your question? Yep, great. We've got someone up the back there?
Hi, my name's Ruth Pilkington. I'm from Legal Aid New South Wales. I feel obliged to speak on behalf of lawyers who actually try and do things in a collaborative manner and work with many of our colleagues here with funding that we've received from the Commonwealth, very gratefully, to do things such as provide advice. Since 2009, my good colleague here, Anna, who provides advice every week at the FRC in Coffs Harbour in New South Wales. And then we've received funding to do things such as the family advocacy and support services. And we've presented about health justice partnerships, all things we've heard about in the course of this conference. And in all of those things, we're working very collaboratively with colleagues in lots of different areas. And can I say, we have the most extraordinary success in reaching people at the right times because of those partnerships. Only yesterday, I'm advised, a 10-week-old baby was retained by the non-primary carer in southwest Sydney. The mother was referred to Judge Meyer's registry, saw one half of the FAS service and was referred to the women's services. Then the father turned up at the court. No one had referred him there, and the two lawyers' services negotiated a parenting plan. The child was returned, and then both parties were referred off to FDR. There was no application made to the court. And those people, we hope, will go on to become good co-parents for that 10-week-old child. And there are examples like that happening all the time with those, I think, really innovative services that have been funded by the Commonwealth. And so, yeah, I suppose it's perhaps you might just take it as a comment that I don't necessarily think that lawyers are always working against a lot of the things that we all are hoping to achieve of putting the child at the centre. And also the other comment I would make is that to this day, despite all the efforts that people have made to get people trying to resolve issues to go somewhere other than a court, people still come to the court. Like that dad did yesterday. He just turned up there thinking that's where he needed to be. And it was great, I think, that there were services there that could assist him and assist everyone involved.
Thank you. I think that's a great comment, and I think it really points to the power of collaboration. And I know, just thinking of the jurisdiction I work in, I know in both Alice Springs and Darwin there's a huge amount of collaboration. And I think it might be Bruce who mentioned the Family Law Pathways networks are incredibly important. They're services that don't cost the country very much at all, and they get huge value. And I think if I think of the projects we're involved in collaboratively with our legal aids and private lawyers and other services, a lot of those come out of the Family Law Pathways network, where people get to know each other and know about the services they're working in. So thank you for those comments, and I think it does point to the real importance of us all working together. Yep.
And look, if I can make a comment, I'm not here to bag out lawyers, but legal aid do an enormously valuable job, the work that they do. If you could transplant some of the things that you do within legal aid with your mediators and some of the schemes you do and put those into private practice, so that the private practice were funded to do it, it would make such a world of difference. But I think one of the difficult parts, legal aid don't do property work, or they do a tiny speck of property work compared to the vast majority of all the property cases that go through, where it just is. It's the more you bill, the more you get paid, or the longer it takes because you bill by the hour, the more you get paid. But legal aid don't do that. Legal aid aren't getting paid by the hour, so it's a special place they hold. And thank goodness for the role they take, and thank goodness for the work that they promote through the independent children's lawyers and their funding, or them actually running it themselves as in-house ICLs. I couldn't do my job without them.
Great, thanks for those comments, Matt. You just mentioned the huge amount of property. Just for the interest of the audience, about how much do you see in court of property compared to children's matters? What's the sort of breakup percentage-wise?
It goes in ebbs and flows. Like some days I think what I've got, every single matter I've got is property. It's probably, I don't know, Joe would probably comment as well, there'd be maybe a 2/3 parenting, 1/3 property. Is it? Yeah. The trouble is that parents just chew, I should say that, and they often are parents, they chew through the money like it's going out of style. Like you're talking about average cost of a 3-day hearing in property, $130,000. Like hundreds of thousands. Seriously, I know it sounds shocking. That's tiny. I had some parties in my court the other day in a property matter where they had $500,000 left in the bank. Actually, no, they had $400,000 now because they both took $50,000 previously to pay the lawyers. The lawyers had come back and said, no, we need to release another $100,000 reward fees. I asked this one question: what are you both asking for? How far are you apart? It's pretty simple, isn't it? What are your respective positions? How far are you apart? They could not answer. I asked them 5 times. I said, I've asked you 5 times. I don't want to go for number 6. If you can't answer, what are you doing here?
And if you think about the Rolls-Royce of FDR models, where we had, like we were just saying, financial advisors in the room, legally assisted cultural advisors for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander or migrant clients, you could think of a Rolls-Royce model that wouldn't cost $130,000 a year, probably.
And your Rolls-Royce model was still a cheap day out compared to just a directions hearing in my court.
Okay, thank you. More questions? Yes.
Hi, I'm Francesca Gerner. I know we're talking about the ideal family law system, but I'd like to take up Rachel's notion and get the word law out and lift the conversation back to where it begins in the ALRC discussion paper, and that's in with the marketing, the myth busting. You know, there are families out there that are intact, that are fighting like mad, their kids are being damaged, they're doing horrendous threatening things to each other, they're threatening the law, so by the time they break up, they've done so much damage that they, you know, if they don't end up in court, they think they've wasted all that energy. I think we need to go back to the myth busting and say, listen, relationships are hard and this is what you can expect. I don't know, we need to have a reality show that puts a complexion on it that people no longer believe that the family law is a process for getting justice or getting the right answer. That's my comment. I'd like us all to...
Do you think we need to have, Bruce's point is further education, sort of support for people in knowing what a good relationship looks like and what respect in relationship amounts to, and how to do that, how to enact that, especially when so many people, we know now in terms of the statistics in terms of domestic violence, are not having that modelled to them.
And I don't know that I'm not the researcher, but do we know what the family violence numbers are in intact families and where they end up?
That's an unknown figure.
Do they go and split? And if there's been past incidents of family violence, even if things have calmed down, and then the relationship goes into that really fragile state of a separation, the fear that some of the particularly women, I found, the fear that that's going to reignite what that tendency, that violent tendency was. So, the ideal family system for me is a family system that resets all the expectations of what it is to have a good relationship, what it is to have a good breakup, because they do. You know, we're not perfect, some of us.
And it is possible, isn't it? You can have a good breakup. There are lots of people who do it every day. We don't hear about them.
No.
So thanks for that comment, Francesca. Is there anyone else on the panel that wants to comment on that comment?
Well, I think it's true. Part of what you said there, Francesca, was that there's been a loss of trust in the family law system. And so I think there needs to be changes made so that the population at large has an improved trust in the family law system, and so doesn't hear the stories that we've been talking about today. So I think that's one of the recommendations from the Law Reform Commission around setting up some oversight body that has governance of it, that can keep an eye on things, can actually make sure that the practices are properly governed, to make sure there's proper complaints mechanisms there for people, and can tackle parts of the industry, if you like, that have gone feral.
Do we have more questions from the audience?
Yes.
Yes.
Simon Curran here from Relationships Australia, Victoria. Picking up on what Bruce was mentioning about maybe the role of psychiatrists, I would just respond to that and say maybe there's a role for interventions that are informed by neuroscience, particularly around stress. Prolonged stress, we know, has lots of effects, but one of the measured effects is the way it interferes with people's capacity to make decisions. It makes it really hard to sort the wood out from the trees, and as FDRPs I think we've often seen where obvious solutions lie before a client and then they can't see it. And the other one is really around self-determination, and it goes to what we've just heard, I guess, around education, is that we don't teach children around conflict resolution and conflict management, let alone the professionals that we've talked about in legal studies and so on. So the expectation for people to be able to just sort their stuff out at the most intense moment of their life without that kind of preliminary training baseline through their childhood and schools is really asking too much very often, I think. So those are the two propositions I've put to the panel.
So 2 points there from Simon around neuroscience and stress. Would any of the panel like to comment on that one first?
AB, do you want to?
Now, I'll comment on the second one first, if I may, which was...
Yes, you may.
Self-determination. I think it goes back to that idea of the public health model. So if we look at the family violence sector at the moment and the problems we've got in our community around family violence, we have tertiary services that work with users of violence. We have services to protect women and children. We're involving the police much more, a whole raft of tertiary. But the early intervention, the primary services, are around getting into the schools and working at a level of gender equity and really getting that belief structure sorted in the schools. And that's happening. And that is actually the solution to the problem long term. And I think some of what you're talking about there, Simon, is pertinent for that. Even the commentary we've had around assisting people to recognise what's a good relationship and recognise how you resolve disputes and how you manage yourself in disputes. I know that there's some good work being done in schools, and I think that's the answer to that question.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Andrew. And what about the use of knowledge of neuroscience and stress and how we can use that?
I think that's a really great idea, Simon. I think it's, there has to be much more cross-fertilisation, I think, from disciplines.
Yeah.
And those, neuroscience and psychology are so critical in terms of understanding how people work and how optimal functioning can be promoted. So I think, working with those, self-determination theory from positive psychology is another thing that those four elements that Howard Bath was talking about actually sit very well with self-determination theory. We need to be preventing things from getting into terrible states, and promoting the positive resolution of things through these methods that we know work from psychology and from neuroscience. And we can be far more effective in our practice if we're informed by cross-disciplinary thinking. So I totally agree with you, Simon.
Good. We've probably got time for one more question. Is there someone else? Yes?
Hi, Tori Cook, Practice Specialist, Family Violence and Child Safety for Relationships Australia, Victoria. So having worked in the family violence field for 2 decades, both with women affected by violence and also men who are users of violence, for quite some time there's been a strong struggle around language and the language of high conflict and family violence. And I guess there's a question for me in terms of how far along are we in having much better clarity around what constitutes family violence and what constitutes high conflict, because there's often some really devastating outcomes when the robust social science around what we know and in our risk assessments with men using violence, and then what happens when they that when they're presented in court in terms of interpretation. Do you think that moving forward that we are in a much better position to have a much stronger understanding of the differences between the two?
Rachel,
I think it's critical that I've put my women's legal service hat on. It's critical that we distinguish between those concepts, and I think it's a really important thing for you to raise that domestic violence is not high conflict. High conflict is where people are arguing and it can get pretty intense, but it's not domestic violence, it's not coercive control. So we have to be really clear about that, and I think in the sector there's been some conflation of the two. I certainly hear it, people labelling domestic violence as high conflict. So I don't think that's helpful. I think we need to be really clear about what domestic violence is so that we can manage it head on and really get appropriate design in terms of what we're doing with families in place for safety, because otherwise this figure of one woman dying every week from domestic violence is not going to change, and that has to change, doesn't it? Yeah, thank you for raising that point.
Thanks, Rachel. Rachel, there was something you mentioned earlier on quite a different note, which was that the system should be contemporary, and I wondered if we're thinking towards the future, and I know someone on the panel had mentioned there's something like 43 relationship separation apps out there now.
Me.
You, yes. We haven't had time for the 8 ball, but would you like to comment a little bit about maybe the use of technology in FDR or in relationship separation?
I want to speak very quickly because I do want to get to the 8 ball because it is so much fun. So while we're sitting there, I'd love to take 1 or 2 questions for the 8 ball.
This might be your segue here.
No, we'll see. But one idea that we've been playing with, so we're doing some work on smartphone apps because everyone, doesn't matter where you are, you seem to have smartphone apps going on. And one idea is around monitoring, so that this stuff we're doing, looking at apps, whether they reduce conflict or create conflict, and which functions, the tone meter, don't say that, this kind of stuff. So we're evaluating these 43 Australian and overseas apps that you can get here in Australia. But I'm fascinated by the monitoring component, and I was speaking with John Graham yesterday, and I know of an ICL over at Karen Field told me about the ICL who just monitors communication on my mob, and just that monitoring deals with this disinhibition effect. And so when I was speaking with John Graham yesterday, John basically monitors his clients' emails, and if he doesn't have to do anything, it's free. But if he needs to intervene in the communication, he charges. And that's had a really powerful effect on the communication that's been going on in these high conflict cases.
Interesting.
So
Yeah.
I think there's actually a lot of fascinating work to be done around the use of monitoring electronically around communication to try to disturb what's going on.
There's also been an increase, hasn't there, in the use of technology and apps for the perpetration of violence. And I know a lot of our clients at Women's Legal Service, I know of a particular instance where following technology was used to actually listen in on a consultation at our service.
And there's 2 guys who I met recently somewhere who had developed this watch. They're both Navy SEALs, and one's technology focused, and they have a watch for women in high-risk situations, and they can push it. They're on it all the time. They just push the watch, because they found with phones, when something's going down, people take phones or throw phones or drop phones in the panic. But by having this watch and pushing it, within a couple of minutes, the police are there. It's an awesome bit of technology.
Andrew or Matt, do you want to comment on technology?
Well, I think there's also increasing usage of artificial intelligence in order to manage communication between couples that are in conflict. I know, again, in the States, there are many judges there that require clients to use a particular program that allows them to manage and monitor their parental agreement, and that program manages their communications, and if you make a derogatory comment, the program will suggest that maybe you might want to rephrase that comment. And the beauty for the judge is the judge can look at a case if it comes back to the court and track what they've done and how they've communicated and what's happened and who's disagreed. And so that apparently is working well there. Again, it's a question as to whether Australians are the same culture and can actually adapt the same thing, but it certainly has got potential, I think.
Yeah, I think if we're planning a system for the future, it's interesting to talk about the use of technology. Well, we've got about 2 minutes for each panellist to sum up now, so you might want to use your 2 minutes for the eight. Oh, you want to go last? Yep. All right. So, Rachel, would you like to sum up your thoughts on the matter?
Okay, so summing up, I think to the ALRC, maybe the opportunity to say to Andrew in his role there that perhaps we've got to stop tinkering and we have to get a clean slate. Maybe, I know you're not going to think about that now because that'd be too difficult, but perhaps, I just don't know that tinkering with what we've got is going to really fix a system that many people are saying is in crisis and that is doing harm to people.
Andrew, would you like to go next?
Sure, yeah. As long as I'm not after Bruce, that's okay.
I'm thinking I'll even go before Bruce.
I think that I agree with what Rachel's saying there. The problem we've got is we've been trying really hard for many, many years. We've done more reforms and more clever reforms, I think, in the last 10 years than any other country. So that's good in a way, but it's meant that we've done a piecemeal approach. And so it doesn't all fit together. And there are various ways of doing a workaround of some reforms that have been implemented in the past. So I think we've got a system that, I like to actually argue that it's quite a good system, but it doesn't all work together well. And so I think we need to have a systemic view which says, somewhat along the lines of what Rachel's saying there, I'm not saying we'd start from scratch, but we need to have a total view of every part of the system and look how that works together.
Yeah. Thank you. And Matt, have you got some thoughts that you haven't yet conveyed or some summing up?
No, I guess probably for the ALRC, from my point of view, there are more people in this room that have answers to solve the problems of the parties who appear before me than I will ever by making orders about their lives. I think if we can involve more of the alternative system than the family law courts trying to resolve matters, the better.
Great, thank you.
Did you want to sum up while it's out there, Paul?
All right, I'll do that. So I guess I was sort of thinking along the same lines. I think throughout this conference and particularly throughout this morning and this session, we've had some terrific ideas come up, and I hope that what Andrew suggested this morning, that there might be ALRC spies in the room, I hope that's true and that they've been listening, because from a number of different professions and backgrounds, we've heard some fabulous ideas, some innovative ideas, and a wealth of really constructive ideas, and quite a consensus, I think, about working together and the willingness in the sector to work together and the great wealth that comes out of working together. So I would just like to thank all the panel members for their contributions and thank all of you for your questions and contributions as well.